Hello and welcome to another astrology video. As always, if you're interested in a personal consultation, because I have had people ask that several times, I will link my email address in the description and you can ask me for further details. Today I wanted to make a video about something which is really unrelated to the other videos that I made. My style is a little bit more chaotic, but I really feel like I have to make a video about a subject when I really feel like it and I really have something to say. I will continue with the Venus and Sun series at some point, but today I really wanted to make a quick video about an aspect that I've been thinking about for a long time again, and that I have some important things to say, to point out. Again, it is a composite chart aspect, and namely the Sun conjunct Mercury aspect. The conjunction is pretty much the only aspect that Sun and Mercury can make in the composite chart, as well as Sun and Venus. They can only make conjunctions. But this particular aspect, there are some patterns that I have noticed over the years that I have studied charts, and that I've had, again, noticed this aspect as well in my own relationships, friendships and otherwise. And I just couldn't help notice that there are some patterns repeating, and I feel like there are some things worth mentioning. Without further ado, the main idea that I want to convey is that I really feel this aspect gives people a sense of false compatibility. And the reason I say false compatibility is because in today's world, in the age of information, we are living in very so-called mercurial times, very intellectualized, very analytical. The age of information, the age of online interactions, the age of, social networks, etc. So many people meet online. People who get in romantic relationships, they meet online. And so when you meet somebody online, basically the first thing that you come into contact with is not their literal energy that you would maybe pick up when you meet in person, but more specifically, what you come in contact with is exactly the spectrum, if you will, of their energy, which Mercury dominates in a chart. Namely, the intellectual energy, the ideas of a person, their manner of communicating, everything that has to do with the mind, everything that has to do with a person's general way of thinking patterns, thought patterns. And the reason I say is again, going back to the idea I started, the reason I think this particular aspect gives a quote-unquote fake sense of compatibility is because people nowadays put so much emphasis on intellectual compatibility. We tend to equate people nowadays with their minds. And so when two people meet, especially when they meet online and they have this conjunction, this can really definitely can show intellectual compatibility. And, this particular aspect will bring that kind of interaction where you literally think as one person. You can be so similar in thinking that you finish each other's sentences, and you tend to communicate very easily, but on a really, let's say masculine level. It's definitely nothing to do with an emotional aspect or passion or, any of that, unless you also have Mars, Venus mixed up with this aspect, or have a lot of Mars, Venus aspects in other places in the composite chart or synastry. But otherwise, if you don't have this, if you just have, Sun composite Mercury is like the strongest aspect that your Mercury and Sun make or something, this will be a really brainy relationship. And it can definitely, it's not to say, that Sun conjunct Mercury is like a negative aspect. It's not a negative or a positive aspect. If anything, it would be more of a positive aspect to have in any relationship, because it shows ease of communication and, intellectual, mental compatibility, of course. But the problem is, again, in today's world, we tend to overemphasize the intellectual compatibility. And so one of the things that I have noticed is that this aspect actually appears in relationships that can last for a very, very long time. And they seem to get along very well on the surface, especially as friends. But when you actually dig a little bit under the surface and you check their charts, you see that these people probably actually have a lot of frustrations in that particular relationship. Because, you could have, like, let's say, a very mercurial relationship with a lot of Mercury compatibility, but you may not have any passion, or like maybe your Mars is not making any major aspect in the composite chart, or maybe your Moon is making no real positive aspect in the composite chart, which basically shows emotional dissatisfaction on every plane. In every sense of the word. But if you have Sun conjunct Mercury composite, you will still tend to think, well, I'm actually meant to be with this person. I mean, we complete each other's sentences, I am like, we're compatible, we get along so well, we can talk about anything. Sort of we can talk about anything. Because, again, if you just have this aspect without any, without having, Venus thrown into this conjunction, or having Moon aspecting Mercury as well, the intellectual compatibility can be very unromantic and unemotional at all. So it will be purely a friendship kind of relationship. And don't get me wrong, some people are perfectly fine with that, but a lot of people, they can have this aspect in composite charts, and they will build up frustrations about how they are incompatible in many crucial areas, because for real, genuine, quote unquote, let's say soulmate compatibility or visceral compatibility, you have to look at the major, all the other major planets, especially Sun, Moon, Venus, Mars, because these are the planets which show, the female-male energy in the chart and the way that they interact in the composite chart. This is all talking strictly about composite charts right now. And what I also wanted to say is, going back to the original idea of Mercury rules the mind, you really, with this aspect in itself, it doesn't tell you anything about the people's physical compatibility, which is shown by Mars, or value system compatibility, which is shown by Venus, and romantic compatibility, which is also shown by Venus, or compatibility in higher belief system and philosophy of life, which is shown by Jupiter, or compatibility of emotional compatibility, which is shown by Moon, etc., etc. So you really have to look at the entire chart. And just for fun, I mean, it's difficult to find a lot of information about composite charts, but I have checked a few long-term relationships. And for instance, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, which were one of the most long-lasting couples in Hollywood history, and they were famously devoted to each other, and had a reputation of being very loyal and very committed and very much in love and very stable. They actually did not have this aspect in synastry, which of course you can say, well, that doesn't really mean anything. Actually, it kind of does. Because if you look at their chart, they have a lot of very strong compatibility aspects, one of which is Sun conjunct Moon composite. I mean, this in itself is a very, very powerful sign of compatibility, genuine compatibility, because the moon represents your basic feminine emotional needs, and the sun represents your basic masculine goals and spiritual needs. And when you have the conjunction, or when you have any kind of supportive aspect between the sun and the moon in the composite chart, it simply shows that these people really feel they're getting their needs met on a very basic level. Nobody's stepping on each other's toes to get anything. They feel supported and contained in the relationship, and they feel understood, and everything that they need, basically is catered to. Another example of a couple is, again, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, which is not a surprise because it's not a surprise because, again, composite Sun conjunct Mercury can definitely appear in a lot of long-term relationships. But one of the things that can be said is these relationships will always have some kind of an intellectual undertone. This is the kind of relationship where you can overanalyze everything to the point where you have no more magic left in that relationship, or no more romance, no more passion. And some people, again, they could really be okay with that. Like, some people will see relationships as much more of a friendship. This can also depend a lot on the way that the person is raised. Because if you are raised, I don't know, your parents had a marriage out of convenience just to have a family and to take care of kids and stuff like that, and you are used to the idea that, marriage is compromise and all you need is somebody that you can get along with and not kill each other, then you could be content in this kind of a relationship. But the risk of that is that, if you have like an intellectually based relationship that doesn't also cater to all the other needs of a person, like, emotional, spiritual, physical, etc., etc., the likelihood of infidelity is very high in that relationship. Because eventually you will meet somebody who makes you feel passionate and, irrational and whatever. And you will be tempted to step outside of the relationship, of course. That's what happens. Another example, Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier. Now, again, with Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier, it's like one of those relationships where I don't even think you have to know that they didn't have any... they didn't have a Sun-Mercury conjunction in order to really understand that was a very passionate relationship, and it was very much based on things that were not intellectual. And what a coincidence as well that these two couples, two of the three couples I mentioned so far, namely Paul Newman, Joanna Woodward, and Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier, they both were born, in the first half of the 20th century when, it was not the age of technology, when, I'm sorry to say this is an entire debate in itself, but basically when women's needs were acknowledged, when men's needs were acknowledged, and I'm talking about basic biological needs. Things were not so detached from the physical reality of life, basically, or the so-called animal physical side of a human being was much more acknowledged back then when things were not so intellectualized, blah, blah, blah. And so I think to some extent it also shows that people back then did not really rate intellectual compatibility high on their list of priorities when they were looking for a mate, which again actually can be a sign of the times. Maybe the fact that Sun conjunct Mercury has become such a popular aspect to have in relationships, it could also be due to the fact that we are in the age of Aquarius and it's getting more heightened and we are becoming more technological, and women have become much more emancipated in the past century, and so women themselves maybe are looking for a man who shares their ideas and can be friends with, first of all, and men will look for that in a woman as well. So it could explain why this aspect is much more popular, because believe me, I would say probably 8 times out of 10 when you see like a long-term relationship, you will see this conjunction. Especially when you know of cases where people met in either online or in some kind of like an intellectual environment, like at work or at school, etc. They will have this conjunction. Another example, or if you will, a counter-example, actually, of how this can play out the wrong way. Oh, wait, before I get into the next example, one thing that I did want to also mention about Laurence Olivier and Vivian Lee is that when you look at their charts, they have like Sun square Moon, they have Venus square Mars. This is a very, very emotionally charged interaction. And although these aspects are not harmonious, they're not exactly positive, they still brew a lot of passion and a lot of romantic interest, a lot of physical interest for each other. I would imagine, especially since they were artists, they were very drawn to this kind of an energy. And any kind of contact actually between the sun and moon in the composite chart is generally seen as a positive aspect to have, even when you have the square, even though the square is much more difficult to handle than a harmonious aspect, like conjunction, trine, or sextile. And another thing that I wanted to say is actually their Mercury in their composite chart only makes 2 major aspects. One of them is square Moon, and the other one is sextile Saturn. And again, square Moon is actually very good, because here you see that they are able to talk about their emotions. When you have like Mercury Moon aspects, they're actually better in some sense than the Sun Mercury aspects, whether in composite, whether in synastry as well, because it simply shows that you are able to understand each other emotionally and to talk about your feelings, and this is really important in a long-term relationship for your mental, emotional health, obviously. And it also shows that you feel supported in the relationship. And it can also be definitely a kind of a friendship aspect, but it's much more emotionally based and more romantic, if you will, than the Sun-Mercury aspect. Okay, so moving on to the final case that I found, which is, like I mentioned before, a counter example of how this Sun-Mercury conjunction can go wrong. Here we have Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. Okay, I don't need to tell you, obvious case of infidelity. Now, I'm not trying to say that, I don't know, these people weren't in love with each other. Maybe they were at the beginning of their lives or when they were first getting together. But looking at their composite chart, so actually the Sun conjunct Mercury is the strongest aspect, the strongest conjunction in their chart. And their moon only makes 2 major aspects, opposite Venus and trine Saturn. Now, you have to understand that trine Saturn is actually any aspect involving Saturn, but especially the conjunction and the trine are very likely to make a relationship last for a very long time. You know, it's going to make it very stable and very, these people will feel a strong sense of responsibility for each other, and they will want to get into a relationship for the long term. But the moon, any kind of aspect between the moon and Saturn, actually shows a very emotionally repressed kind of a relationship. You know, it's not the kind of crazy, passionate, romantic, emotional aspect that you would find in Moon-Mars relationships, for instance, or a Moon-Venus relationship, or Moon-Pluto even. This is a very contained sort of aspect. And the fact that they have moon opposite Venus in the composite chart does definitely show that there is or there was a strong affection there and a strong emotional attraction between them. But overall, their Mars, for instance, makes no major aspect, which is like, oh my god, their Mars, Mars, which is basically the planet of passion, of sexuality, especially masculine sexuality, doesn't make any major aspects, and this is really, in my opinion, the typical example of a rather, pardon my expression, dry composite chart where there is very little emotional depth and passion and excitement, yet there is intellectual compatibility and there is emotional stability, and I'm pretty sure that one or both of them got into this relationship for pragmatic reasons. Especially since they were, I understood, like, both in the same field, etc., etc. And so they probably had shared ambitions, shared interests, and they thought they would make a good couple. But as it usually happens, like I mentioned before, the risk of these kinds of relationships are what we would call, or what most people would call, settling kind of relationships, when you just settle for somebody that you are sort of okay with and you understand and you get along with as friends, but there is no great passion and no great joy. This is the risk. The risk is that eventually you do meet somebody who makes you feel passionate and joyful, and you will be very tempted to cheat, to step outside of the relationship or break up, or just get so frustrated that you just want to be alone. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I don't know. I would be very curious to hear what other people have to say. Maybe you can give a lot of counterexamples. So like I said, I'm not trying to say that this is a bad aspect to have. It's definitely not. But in any relationship, it will give an intellectualized kind of energy. And if there is like not a lot of passionate aspects elsewhere in the composite chart, it can lead to a very dry, emotionless, passionless kind of relationship. And another thing that I wanted to mention, one last thing, is in Laurence Olivier and Vivian Lee's case, their composite chart, all of the planets in the composite chart, pretty much, or the main planets, made aspects to their personal planets, to each of their personal planets, which is a very important sign that they were both very driven to maintain the relationship. For instance, the composite moon was conjunct Vivian Lee's sun, which in itself would translate into she was feeling nurtured, or her life's goal, if you will, her soul's purpose, which is shown by the sun, was nurtured by this relationship. And there are plenty of them. So these are, again, very important aspects to check in compatibility with regards to the composite chart. Because if you have like a composite chart between two people, let's say, makes a lot of aspects to the personal planets and points of one person, but not the other one, this simply shows that, the person who's most aspected by the composite chart will feel more compelled to hold on to this relationship for various reasons, depending on the planets involved. But they will definitely feel more drawn and more compatible to the relationship itself, and more attached to the relationship itself than the person who doesn't have his or her personal planets aspected by any points or planets in the composite chart. Sorry for maybe complicating this, but here it is. So that's all I wanted to say. If you have any comments, please comment below. And yep, don't forget that if you are interested in consultations, you can send me an email at the address that I will write in the description. And thank you for being a good audience.